Na Kráľovej holi stojí strom zelený. Na Kráľovej holi stojí strom zelený.
Back in the 1950s, behind the Iron Curtain, when Czechoslovakia was under direct control of the Soviet Union and Joseph Stalin, the moustache man himself, Joseph Stalin had some radical, crazy ideas. Some of these ideas were by changing our local climate in order to grow tropical plants to be self-sustainable. These included pineapple, rice, just like in Japan, and a rubber plant, so they can have their own rubber, just like they tried to grow in Hungary at the time.
Did you know any of this? I didn't, and I'm a native Slovakian. But it's fine, you're lucky enough, you're here in this video, and welcome to the first episode of Deep Dive. And if you want to learn, stick with me, buckle up, and let's learn, alright?
Somewhere in the world, there's a small country of my origin called Slovakia, located in Central Europe, and remember that one? It was once upon a time connected to our brothers and sisters in Czechia. Now, from the end of World War II up until about the 1992, the two countries were united to form Czechoslovakia, actually one of the most prosperous satellite states of Soviet Union in the Eastern Bloc.
With self-sustainability, with equality of life, and many other things which a lot of generations are actually looking back on now, to this day, and reminiscing about how great it was. Now, yes, I have said Soviets, and for nearly 4 decades, for 40 years, Soviet Union has controlled Czechoslovakia. They've placed their puppet communist government in Prague, and basically whatever shots they were calling is how it was going to be.
This overlord of the Soviet Union has eventually led to a lot of unrest amongst the people wanting to have their own independence. This has actually led to an event called Prague Spring, where overnight in 1968, Soviet Union, with their warplanes, their tanks and their massive army, has rushed the capital of Czechoslovakia, Prague, as well as Bratislava. And this is exactly what you can see on the screen right now, is people protesting in Prague, protesting the turn-up of the Soviet soldiers in their tanks and warplanes and their massive army. And I mustn't forget to mention that a hell of a lot of people have died in these protests over the next following few weeks and months, as the Russians have heavily occupied Czech Republic and Slovakia.
In this time, some pretty crazy shit was going down. Uncle Joe, yes, Joseph Stalin, the mustachioed man, had some pretty crazy ideas. Some of them which involved science, some of them which didn't, which involved gulags. Yeah, go and figure. He tried to actually change the environment, basically, in order to grow tropical fruits in Czechoslovakia, which is, to me, mind-blowing, because knowing how the climate was, especially at the time in Czechoslovakia, with brutally cold, harsh winters and scorching hot summers, I have no idea how he was able to do this. So let's have a look and see how he was trying to organise this in order to change the environment, the biome, the weather in the country. Unbelievable. If you don't know what the climate was like at the time in Czechoslovakia in the post-war times, it was actually brutally cold winters, especially in the northern regions, and scorching hot summers. Now, this has changed a little bit with the global warming and the climate warming up in general, as we've seen around the world. And in recent years, the summers have been scorching hot. We're talking like 35 degrees plus for weeks and weeks on end. And I can give you this from my first-hand experience living in Prague for 6 months last year. But how insane is that? Some bloke from Russia coming over and thinking that he can change the weather in order to grow tropical fruits. I mean, that's mind-blowing on its own, isn't it? Now, društvo, we have to talk about this. It's a collective farm which was incredibly popular at the time in the Eastern Bloc, which gave everyone in villages and towns a job and self-sustainability. Imagine if this was happening now. Now, a lot of people are still very reminiscent of this time and very nostalgic, including my parents, for example, because at the time, especially later on in the 1960s, 1970s, Czechoslovakia was actually a very self-sustainable country, and they were able to grow a lot of their own stuff. Because there were some positives, don't get me wrong, there was also a lot of negatives, just like with every one of these matrix system controlling the people around the world. Now, društvo, look, these collective farms didn't have the numbers in order to be able to undertake such a large scientific task. As well as you can imagine, the Russians, the Soviets, so to speak, weren't exactly generous with their money at the time, because as you can imagine, after the end of World War II, they were in control of such a massive land. Like, if you look at the map here, from half of Germany, all of Eastern Europe, all of Baltic states, Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan, all the little countries, and as you probably know, watching this video, during World War II, a lot of Russia, a lot of Eastern Europe has been destroyed and has been damaged, as well as a lot of East Germany, obviously, which was in control of Russia, including Berlin. Now, because of that, they weren't able to fund half of their satellite states the way they should have been funded in order to undertake these large tasks. This was a major fail when it comes to trying to grow tropical plants in a fairly extreme weather climate of Czechoslovakia. But to be fair, in the 1960s and 1970s, and even in the 1980s, a hell of a lot of people thought that was a very prosperous time for Czechoslovakia, and you know, a lot of people are actually reminiscing of those times still to this day, again including my parents. At the time, in the 1960s, 70s and 80s, Czechoslovakia was actually one of the most prosperous satellite states, and they were very self-sustainable. I mean, they were making their own cars, they were making their own food, they were making their own clothing, their own shoes, etc. And tell me, what other country was doing this at the time, you know, during 1960s and 70s? I mean, especially in the Eastern Bloc, under the control of the Soviet Union, because don't get me wrong, some of these products weren't exactly perfect. The cars, for example, Skoda, Tatra, some incredibly groundbreaking cars, some incredibly smart engineers in Mladá Boleslav, just above Prague. It's about an hour north of Prague. I've actually been there last year when I was over in Czech Republic. Incredible museum. I recommend you go check it out. Look, all of these materials were coming from the Soviet Union. The metals, the leather for the shoes, the cotton for the clothing, etc., the crops for the food. And don't get me wrong, sometimes this was a little subpar because Soviet Union didn't quite have the scientific knowledge on some of these things, as well as they were using most of these raw materials such as metal for the actual country of Russia at the time. At the time, we were getting a little bit throttled back and held back by the Soviet Union. And in my opinion, personally, I think Czechoslovakia could have thrived so much more under this time if Uncle Joe didn't come over to Czechoslovakia in 1968 with his tanks and his warplanes and didn't occupy us under the Warsaw Pact. So thanks for that, my friend, Uncle Joe.
Now look, a little fact for you. In 1953, the Soviets have sent out a pretty questionable Soviet scientist called Trofim Denisovich Lysenko, who was also tasked with setting up an Academy of Agriculture in Czechoslovakia in order to spread his propaganda of his pretty questionable science experiments, which have actually led to the famine in Ukraine and the rest of the Soviet Union for the years to come. So not exactly the greatest guy ever, has he?
Knowing the Soviets, of course, they took this to the next level, and they started parading around local towns and villages in Czechoslovakia in trucks filled with fake crops, trying to show people that it was possible to grow these tropical plants in their crazy weather climate. Now, government lying, Soviets lying, can't believe the governments and politicians lie. How did this all end? Now look, the windbreaker tree lines, which were actually planted in order to stop the erosion of farmland away, they fell into the state of disrepair, and they can actually be seen in a lot of Czech Republic and Slovakia to this day between the fields, separating the fields to stop the wind from eroding the ground. What has happened here is that a lot of the trees were actually non-native, and as a result, they didn't have the capacity to be able to replant and look after these trees. So a lot of them have gone beyond the point of disrepair, and you can actually see them in the countries, Czech Republic and Slovakia, still to this day.
Dny nové techniky ukazují, že zprůmyslnění našeho zemědělství není jen planá fráze.
Now let's move on to rice, okay? Whilst in Hungary, they were trying to grow rubber plants, South Moravia, specifically Rakvice, were tasked with growing rice. They had to build water channels out of concrete and little rivers to keep the rice moisturised, etc. They later abandoned this idea too, and still, to this day, there's a hell of a lot of little channels underneath fields which channel away river water so that the rivers don't flow over the fields and destroy the crops. It's unbelievable, isn't it, thinking about it, how there's so many abandoned little tunnels for the rivers under the fields. And if you actually started digging away now to go and have a look at them, they still would be there and still would be used to this day. Now, growing cotton is another thing that the Soviets have tried to con us to do. Žitný ostrov, to be specific. which translates to Žitný Island, is located south of Bratislava, near Dunajská Streda, and it's got this very interesting microclimate, which is scorching hot summers, but also very moist and wet because of the Danube River flowing through it, which allowed for a very interesting environment actually, and potentially the ability to grow cotton. But as you can imagine, this has also failed, so nothing new on this front either. Special breed of socialist horse. Small working horse, which Russians tried to sort of crossbreed in order to create this special little horse, which was strong enough to carry a plough behind it, but also was motivated enough to do it. As you can imagine, this has failed because the horses were a lot more lethargic and weaker, as they've actually intended, and they really couldn't be asked to carry the plough behind them, because I wouldn't either, so I don't blame the horse. Obviously, if you take a little trip to Czech Republic, Czechia, sorry all you Czechs out there, and Slovakia, you still can see the remainder of these tree lines, some of these even cotton fields, some of the plants are still around the area, you know, they're still sort of hanging around, and I encourage you to go and see it, and let me know in the comment section below if you do go and see it. But regardless, that's enough for this little educational video. Let me know in the comment section below what you think. This is the first installment in this series of deep dives. I love deep dives, and there's going to be deep dives on many different topics, not just geography and history. Let me know in the comment section below what you would like me to do a deep dive on, and what you would like to learn, because I love learning as well, and it's just interesting, isn't it, sharing this sort of information. Oh yeah, and I forgot to say, tell me something interesting about your country in the comment section below. I would love to hear some interesting facts, stories, or history about your country. Like the video if you liked it, comment something in the comment section below, subscribe to the channel if you want to see more of this interesting little content, experimental content, and yeah, I'll see you in a bit. Have a lovely rest of your day.